December 7, 1941, the date that dragged America into World War II with the fury of bombs raining down on Pearl Harbor. As the Pacific theater erupted into chaos, American military commanders faced a terrifying reality. Their codes were being broken faster than cryptographers could create them. Japanese intelligence units had become masters at intercepting and deciphering Allied communications, turning every radio transmission into a potential death sentence for American forces. On remote islands scattered across the Pacific, Marines whispered anxiously about the enemy's uncanny ability to predict their movements, ambush their patrols, and counter their strategies before battles even began. Something had to change, or the war would be lost before it truly started. In a nondescript office in San Diego, California, Philip Johnston sat forward in his chair, an idea burning in his mind that would revolutionize warfare. The son of Protestant missionaries, Johnston had spent his childhood on the Navajo reservation, learning the intricate language that most outsiders found utterly incomprehensible. He understood what military brass did not. The Navajo language was more than difficult. It was virtually impossible for non-native speakers to learn. Unlike European languages built on Latin roots, Navajo belonged to the Athabascan language family, with tonal qualities, syntax structures, and sound combinations that existed nowhere else on Earth. Johnston knew that fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the entire world could speak the language with any fluency, and none of them were Japanese. The initial response from military officials ranged from skeptical to dismissive. Lieutenant Colonel James Jones listened politely to Johnston's proposal in early 1942, but struggled to see how a Native American language could succeed where complex mechanical cipher machines had failed. The military had invested millions in encryption technology, employing mathematicians and linguists to create supposedly unbreakable codes. How could an unwritten tribal language possibly outperform the latest scientific achievements? Johnston persisted, demonstrating the language's complexity by bringing Navajo friends to perform live translations. The officers watched in amazement as the speakers communicated rapidly in sounds that seemed to defy transcription, with subtle tonal shifts that changed meanings entirely. According to wartime records preserved in the National Archives, the demonstration proved decisive. Jones authorized a pilot program, recruiting 29 young Navajo men who would become the first code talkers. These recruits arrived at Camp Elliott in May 1942, uncertain of what their role would be, but determined to serve their country despite decades of mistreatment at the hands of the American government. Many had attended government boarding schools designed to eliminate their native culture, where speaking Navajo had been forbidden and punished. Now, ironically, that same language the government had tried to erase would become one of America's most valuable weapons. The original 29 faced an extraordinary challenge: creating a military code from a language that had no words for modern warfare concepts. Navajo possessed no terms for tanks, submarines, bombers, or grenades. Working in intense sessions, the Code Talkers developed a dual-layer encryption system that combined direct Navajo translations with an elaborate substitution alphabet. For military terms without Navajo equivalents, they created metaphors drawn from the natural world. A turtle became a tank, a bird became an aircraft, and sharks represented destroyers cutting through ocean waters. This creative vocabulary would soon prove impenetrable to enemy codebreakers. Through the sweltering summer of 1942, the original 29 Code Talkers worked 18-hour days constructing their linguistic fortress. Staff Sergeant Philip Johnston observed the process with growing respect, watching young men like Chester Nez, who had been punished for speaking his native tongue at boarding school, now using that forbidden language to defend the nation that had oppressed his people. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. These Marines were transforming their ancestral language into a weapon more powerful than any artillery piece, more reliable than any encryption machine the government cryptographers had devised. The code required memorization of over 400 military terms, each with multiple Navajo equivalents to prevent pattern recognition. The word for America became Our Mother, while Australia was rendered as Rolled Hat. Countries received nature-based designations that made sense within Navajo cultural context but appeared completely random to outsiders. The genius lay in the system's flexibility. Code talkers could translate messages using different word combinations each time, making frequency analysis impossible. Japanese cryptographers, who had successfully broken every previous American code, would find no patterns to exploit, no mathematical formulas to unravel. Major General Clayton Vogel reviewed the demonstration exercises with astonishment. Intelligence officers who had cracked Navajo messages recorded during training exercises reported complete failure. Not a single word could be deciphered without a native speaker. Even when Japanese-American linguists working for American intelligence attempted to break the code, they admitted defeat within hours. The language's tonal complexity meant that without perfect pronunciation and cultural context, the sounds became meaningless noise. A single tonal error could transform medicine into mouth or eagle into excrement, rendering any attempted translation useless. The code talkers developed procedures that emphasized speed alongside security. In field tests conducted at Camp Pendleton, they encoded, transmitted, and decoded a 3-line English message in 20 seconds, a task that required cipher machines 30 minutes to complete. This speed would prove critical in combat situations where seconds determined whether Marines lived or died. The Navajo Marines could relay coordinates, troop movements, and tactical orders faster than any mechanical system, providing commanders with real-time communication capabilities their Japanese adversaries could not match or anticipate. As documented in Marine Corps historical records from this period, the success of the pilot program led to immediate expansion. The military authorized recruitment of additional Navajo volunteers, recognizing that this linguistic advantage could shift the Pacific War's momentum. Recruiting stations opened on the reservation, seeking men who spoke fluent Navajo and possessed the physical stamina for Marine Corps training. Young Navajos responded in remarkable numbers, driven by complex motivations, patriotism for America, despite its broken treaties, desire to prove their worth to a nation that had marginalized them, and traditional warrior culture values that emphasized protecting their people and homeland. By autumn of 1942, the second wave of code talkers had completed training and prepared for deployment. These men understood they were creating history, though military secrecy meant their families could not know the true nature of their service. Parents received letters describing basic training and routine duties, with no mention of the linguistic warfare their sons would wage. The code talkers themselves swore oaths of secrecy, understanding that Japanese discovery of their system would eliminate its effectiveness and potentially endanger Navajo communities. They carried their secret to ships departing for combat zones across the Pacific, ready to prove that their language, once banned, dismissed, and nearly destroyed, could win a war. November 1, 1942 marked the Code Talkers' combat debut during the Guadalcanal campaign, where American forces struggled to maintain their precarious foothold on the strategic island. The jungle terrain created communication nightmares. Thick vegetation blocked radio signals, forcing operators to string wire lines that Japanese patrols frequently cut. Into this chaos came the first Code Talker units, joining Marine regiments that had suffered devastating casualties while fighting for every muddy meter of ground. Veteran Marines initially viewed these newcomers with the casual racism typical of the era, questioning whether Indians could handle frontline combat pressures. Private First Class Chester Nez crouched in a foxhole on Guadalcanal's contested perimeter, rain pouring down as artillery shells screamed overhead. His radio crackled with orders from battalion command, delivered in rapid Navajo by another code talker positioned miles away at headquarters. Within seconds, Nez translated the message for his commanding officer. Japanese forces were massing for a counterattack on their sector's left flank. The information arrived faster than encrypted messages could have been decoded, giving Marines precious minutes to reposition machine guns and prepare defensive positions. When the attack came exactly as predicted, American firepower shattered the Japanese advance, saving dozens of Marine lives. The practical advantages became immediately apparent to field commanders who had previously doubted the program's value. Colonel Frank Gutka, before his death in combat that same month, reported that Code Talker communications eliminated the dangerous delays associated with mechanical encryption systems. In fluid battle situations where positions changed hourly, the ability to transmit orders instantly without vulnerability to enemy interception proved invaluable. Japanese radio operators listening to American frequencies heard only incomprehensible sounds, not the structured patterns of ciphertext they had trained to recognize and analyze, but what seemed like random noise completely devoid of linguistic structure. Japanese intelligence officers responded with confusion and mounting frustration. Their sophisticated code-breaking unit, which had successfully penetrated American, British, and Australian encryption systems, found themselves completely baffled by these strange transmissions. Intercept stations recorded hours of Navajo communications, sending the recordings to Tokyo for analysis. According to declassified Japanese military documents examined after the war, cryptographers initially believed they were hearing a variation of Japanese indigenous Ainu language. When that theory proved incorrect, they hypothesized the Americans had developed a new mechanical encryption device producing random sounds. The possibility that this was an actual human language never seriously entered their calculations. The sounds simply did not correspond to any linguistic patterns in their extensive reference libraries. The psychological impact on Japanese forces compounded the tactical advantages. Enemy soldiers had grown accustomed to anticipating American movements based on intercepted communications, giving them confidence and strategic initiative. Suddenly, that advantage vanished completely. American units began appearing in unexpected positions, launching attacks with perfect coordination and avoiding Japanese ambushes with suspicious regularity. The uncertainty eroded Japanese command confidence, forcing them to assume their own codes might be compromised and causing widespread communication paranoia throughout their Pacific forces. By December 1942, demand for code talkers had exceeded supply dramatically. Marine commanders who had witnessed their effectiveness in combat sent urgent requests for additional Navajo communicators. The program expanded rapidly, with recruitment teams returning to the reservation to enlist more volunteers. Young Navajo men who had heard rumors about special wartime service now understood they could contribute unique skills no other Americans possessed. The appeal drew men from traditional families, educated men from reservation schools, and even some who had left the reservation years earlier, all united by their fluency in the language that had survived centuries of Spanish colonization, American expansion, and government suppression. January 19, 1943, brought intensified Japanese efforts to crack what they termed the American Gibberish Code. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy's 4th Fleet Intelligence Section assembled its most accomplished linguists and codebreakers, men who had broken British naval codes and deciphered Australian military transmissions with mathematical precision. Lieutenant Commander Masaru Sasaki led the effort, bringing expertise gained from years studying Western cryptography and linguistic patterns. His team approached the problem systematically, applying every technique that had previously succeeded against Allied communication systems. The recordings of Navajo transmissions defied every analytical method Sasaki's team employed. Frequency analysis, which revealed patterns in alphabetic ciphers, produced nothing but statistical noise. The sounds did not repeat in ways that suggested substitution codes or mechanical encryption. Grammatical structure analysis failed because Japanese linguists could not identify where words began or ended in the continuous stream of unfamiliar phonemes. The tonal qualities particularly frustrated analysts accustomed to non-tonal languages. They could not distinguish whether tone changes represented linguistic meaning or radio distortion. As documented in post-war interrogations conducted by American intelligence, Japanese codebreakers considered the possibility they were hearing a tribal language, but dismissed it as implausibly sophisticated for military use. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, code talkers participated in the New Georgia campaign, where their communications enabled complex amphibious operations requiring precise timing and coordination. Major General Charles Barrett's forces executed landing operations with multiple units hitting different beaches simultaneously, all coordinated through Navajo language radio networks. Japanese observers, accustomed to detecting preparatory signals before American attacks, found themselves blindsided by assaults that materialized without warning. The psychological impact rippled through enemy ranks, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where Japanese officers suspected American spies had infiltrated their headquarters, the only explanation they could conceive for such accurate American intelligence. The code talkers themselves faced dangers beyond enemy fire. Their distinctive appearance and use of an incomprehensible language sometimes caused fellow Marines to mistake them for Japanese soldiers, especially in the confusion of night combat or jungle warfare. Several code talkers were assigned bodyguards, Marines tasked with protecting them from friendly fire and ensuring they did not fall into enemy hands alive. The military understood that a captured code talker could potentially be tortured into revealing the system's mechanics, though the complexity of Navajo grammar made it unlikely Japanese interrogators could exploit such information even if obtained. Thomas Begay recalled years later an incident during the Bougainville campaign in November 1943, where he was nearly shot by a nervous Marine sentry who heard him speaking Navajo on a field telephone. Only the quick intervention of his assigned bodyguard, who shouted recognition codes, prevented the tragic mistake. Such incidents highlighted the precarious position code talkers occupied, essential to American success yet vulnerable to the racism and suspicion that pervaded wartime military culture. They served a nation that had forced their ancestors onto reservations, stolen their lands through broken treaties, and attempted to eradicate their language and culture. Yet they fought with distinction and courage that earned respect from commanders and fellow Marines who witnessed their contributions. By mid-1943, the Code Talker program had expanded to include over 200 Navajo Marines serving throughout the Pacific Theater. Each major operation now incorporated Navajo communicators into planning from the earliest stages. The military's initial skepticism had transformed into complete dependence on a system that provided unbreakable security combined with unprecedented speed. Japanese intelligence continued their futile efforts to penetrate the code, unaware they were attempting to decipher not a code, but an entire language, one that had evolved over centuries in complete isolation from Asian and European linguistic influences, creating sounds and grammatical structures their codebreakers had never encountered and could not imagine. November 20th, 1943 dawned with the thunder of naval bombardment as American forces prepared to assault Tarawa Atoll, a tiny coral island fortress that Japanese commanders had declared impregnable. The battle would become one of the Pacific War's bloodiest engagements, with Marines wading through chest-deep water under withering machine gun fire. Among the first-wave landing craft sat code talkers, who would coordinate the desperate fighting through 3 days of hell. Their radios carried messages that directed artillery fire, called for medical evacuations, and synchronized the complex movements of multiple Marine battalions fighting across a battlefield smaller than a typical American ranch. Private First Class William McCabe crouched behind a shattered seawall as Japanese bullets splintered the coral around his position. His radio handset pressed against his ear. He received targeting coordinates in Navajo from an artillery spotter who had somehow survived the initial landing. McCabe translated instantly for the mortar team beside him, and within seconds, shells arced toward Japanese bunkers that had pinned down an entire company. The speed of this communication cycle, observation to fire mission to impact, occurred in under 2 minutes, a tempo impossible with traditional encoding systems. Japanese defenders found themselves under accurate fire that seemed to anticipate their movements, not realizing that every radio transmission directing that fire remained completely opaque to their signal's intelligence. The scale of Navajo communications during Tarawa demonstrated the program's maturation. According to Marine Corps combat records from the operation, code talkers transmitted over 800 messages during the first 48 hours without a single error in translation or transmission. Major Howard Rice, communications officer for the 2nd Marine Division, stated in after-action reports that the Navajo net provided more reliable intelligence flow than any previous operation he had witnessed. The system's redundancy proved crucial when radio equipment failed or operators became casualties. Replacement code talkers could immediately assume transmission duties without requiring codebook consultations or cipher key updates that would have delayed conventional encrypted communications. Japanese forces defending Tarawa possessed their own sophisticated communications infrastructure, with buried telephone lines connecting defensive positions throughout the island. Yet this elaborate system became a liability when American intelligence intercepted Japanese transmissions and decoded their tactical discussions. The asymmetry proved decisive. American commanders understood Japanese dispositions and intentions while remaining completely mysterious to their adversaries. Japanese Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commanding Tarawa's defense, never understood why his carefully prepared counterattacks consistently met prepared American defenses, or how Marine units seemed to know the locations of his strongest positions before engaging them. The human cost of Tarawa shocked the American public: over 1,000 Marines killed and 2,000 wounded in just 76 hours of fighting. Yet without the Code Talkers' communications, casualties would have been catastrophically higher. Their ability to coordinate close air support prevented friendly fire incidents that had plagued previous amphibious operations. When Marine units became isolated in Japanese-held territory, Code Talker networks maintained contact and directed rescue operations that saved hundreds of lives. The precise artillery fire they enabled destroyed Japanese strongpoints that might otherwise have required costly infantry assaults. Every message transmitted in Navajo represented lives saved through operational efficiency that Japanese forces could not replicate or counter. As 1943 ended, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. American forces had seized initiative across the vast ocean theater, island hopping toward Japan itself, while bypassing and isolating major enemy strongholds. Code Talkers participated in every major operation: New Britain, the Marshall Islands, Saipan, creating a communications web that unified American military power while remaining impenetrable to Japanese intelligence. The original 29 had grown to over 400 Navajo Marines, with recruitment continuing on the reservation as the military's appetite for this unique capability proved insatiable. These men had transformed from curiosity to essential asset, their language becoming as important to American success as aircraft carriers in submarine warfare. February 19, 1945 arrived with an apocalyptic naval bombardment that shook the tiny volcanic island of Iwo Jima to its foundations. For the next 36 days, this 8-square-mile piece of volcanic rock would witness some of World War II's most savage fighting. Among the 70,000 Marines who assaulted the island's black sand beaches were 42 Code Talkers, whose communications would prove instrumental in capturing an island the Japanese had fortified with over 11 miles of tunnels and hundreds of concealed bunkers. The Battle of Iwo Jima would generate more radio traffic than any previous Pacific operation, with Code Talkers working around the clock to coordinate operations across terrain that offered almost no cover and where every cave concealed enemy fighters. Corporal Henry Bake operated his radio from a crater barely large enough for 2 men, Japanese mortars bracketing his position, while he relayed targeting data to naval gunfire controllers offshore. The volcanic terrain created communication dead zones where conventional radios failed, but the Navajo net maintained connectivity through relay stations that passed messages across the island. During the first 3 days of battle, as Marines struggled to capture Mount Suribachi, Code Talkers transmitted over 800 messages coordinating artillery, airstrikes, and infantry movements. Major Howard Connor, 5th Marine Division signal officer, would later state that without the Navajo Code, Marines could not have taken Iwo Jima, a remarkable acknowledgement of how completely the military had come to depend on these communicators. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima included signals intelligence personnel specifically tasked with intercepting American communications. These specialists had received training in identifying cipher patterns and had successfully decoded several Allied systems earlier in the war. Yet the Navajo transmissions that saturated radio frequencies around Iwo Jima left them completely helpless. Post-war interrogations revealed that Japanese intelligence officers suspected the Americans had deployed multiple different codes simultaneously, unable to conceive that a single linguistic system could produce such varied sounds and patterns. They attempted to capture Code Talkers alive, hoping to break the system through interrogation, but the fierce fighting gave them no opportunity. The iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi's summit on February 23rd was coordinated through Navajo communications that ensured combat photographers were in position to capture the moment. The image would become World War II's most famous photograph, symbolizing American determination and sacrifice. Few who saw it knew that the coordination enabling that photograph's creation had been conducted in a language Japanese codebreakers could not penetrate. The flag itself represented victory in a communications war that had been won long before Marines reached Suribachi's summit. As the battle ground into its second and third weeks, Code Talkers operated under conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. They worked in shifts around the clock, often going days without sleep, as operations demanded continuous communication coverage. Japanese artillery and mortar fire specifically targeted radio antennas, making Code Talker positions among the most dangerous on the battlefield. Yet not a single Code Talker broke under the strain, and their transmission accuracy remained perfect throughout the operation. This reliability under extreme stress demonstrated qualities that extended beyond linguistic ability. These men possessed discipline and courage that matched any Marines on the island. The battle officially ended on March 26, 1945, though isolated Japanese holdouts would continue fighting for weeks afterward. American casualties exceeded 26,000, with nearly 7,000 killed, the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. The victory provided air bases from which B-29 bombers could reach Japan with fighter escort, bringing the war's end months closer. Code Talkers had transmitted over 500,000 words during the operation, creating a communication volume that would have been impossible with encryption machines. Their language had proven itself under the worst conditions imaginable, maintaining security while enabling the coordination that made victory possible despite horrific costs. April 1, 1945 marked the beginning of Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. This campaign would become the Pacific War's largest amphibious operation, involving over 180,000 American troops, supported by over 1,000 ships. The battle would rage for 82 days through monsoon rains, kamikaze attacks, and ferocious Japanese resistance that demonstrated how costly an invasion of Japan's home islands would be. Throughout this nightmare campaign, Code Talkers maintained the communications network that held together the massive American war machine, grinding forward against enemy forces, fighting with suicidal desperation. The scale of operations on Okinawa required coordination exceeding anything previously attempted in the Pacific theater. Multiple Marine divisions, Army divisions, and supporting units needed continuous communication while advancing across terrain that varied from beaches to mountains to fortified urban areas. Private First Class Samuel Holliday operated his radio from positions that changed daily as American forces pushed northward, transmitting in Navajo while Japanese artillery fire sought his antenna's location. The mental strain of translating military orders under constant threat of death would have broken many men, yet the Code Talkers maintained their accuracy and composure through weeks of continuous operations. Japanese forces on Okinawa fought with fanatical determination, understanding this was the final barrier protecting their homeland. They employed every tactic developed during 4 years of Pacific warfare: fortified positions in coral caves, nighttime infiltration attacks, massive artillery barrages, and kamikaze strikes against the supporting fleet. Japanese intelligence personnel on the island continued their futile efforts to crack American communications, recording Navajo transmissions in hopes that breakthrough analysis might yet reveal the system's secrets. As documented in captured Japanese documents examined after the war, intelligence officers remained convinced the Americans were using mechanical encryption devices of revolutionary sophistication. The possibility that human language could provide such security remained beyond their conceptual framework. The kamikazes inflicted devastating losses on American naval forces supporting the invasion, sinking dozens of ships and damaging hundreds more. These suicide attacks represented Japan's strategic desperation. Lacking aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots for conventional operations, they transformed planes into guided missiles aimed at American carriers and troop transports. Code Talkers aboard ships offshore coordinated fighter interceptions of kamikaze raids, their radio networks linking carrier-based fighters with radar picket ships that provided early warning. The speed of Navajo communications allowed combat air patrol controllers to vector interceptors toward incoming threats faster than encrypted channels could have managed, shooting down kamikazes before they reached their targets. By June 21st, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa had ended, though isolated holdouts would fight on for months. American casualties exceeded 48,000, including over 12,000 killed, losses that sobered planners contemplating invasion of Japan itself. Code Talkers emerged from the campaign exhausted but unbroken, having transmitted over 2 million words during the operation. Their contribution had been indispensable to American success, yet they remained unknown to the public and unrecognized for their unique service. Military secrecy still cloaked their role, with families back on the reservation, knowing only that their sons and brothers served as Marines somewhere in the Pacific. The war's end came with sudden finality in August 1945. Atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, while Soviet forces invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, ending the most destructive war in human history. Code Talkers heard the news through their radios, broadcasting in both English and Navajo to units scattered across the Pacific. They had participated in every major Marine Corps operation from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, transmitting millions of words in a code that was never broken. Their language, once suppressed and nearly destroyed by government policies, had helped win the war. September 2nd, 1945, witnessed the formal Japanese surrender aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Among the observers stood several Code Talkers, their presence unremarked by journalists and historians focused on the dramatic ceremony. As Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender, these Navajo Marines understood that their contribution would remain classified for decades. The military had ordered them to maintain absolute secrecy about their wartime role, believing the code might be needed in future conflicts. They signed oaths promising never to discuss their service, then began the long journey home to the reservation and a nation that had no idea what they had accomplished. The return to civilian life proved difficult for many Code Talkers. They came home to a reservation plagued by poverty, with limited economic opportunities and continuing discrimination. Unlike other veterans who received public recognition and employment advantages, Code Talkers could not discuss their military service or explain the significance of their wartime contributions. They had protected America using a language the government had once tried to eliminate through boarding schools that punished children for speaking Navajo. The irony remained unspoken, buried beneath layers of official secrecy that would persist for decades after the war's end. Japanese cryptographers finally learned the truth about the unbreakable code in 1946, during post-war debriefings conducted by American occupation forces. According to interviews preserved in military archives, Japanese intelligence officers reacted with astonishment when told the mysterious communications had been a Native American language. They had expended thousands of man-hours attempting to crack what they believed was a sophisticated mechanical encryption system, never imagining that human language could provide such security. The revelation of their complete failure to even identify the nature of the communications represented a profound intelligence defeat. They had been defeated not by technology but by cultural diversity they had not anticipated or understood. The Code Talkers themselves largely maintained their silence until 1968, when the military finally declassified the program. Even then, recognition came slowly. The first reunion of Code Talkers occurred in 1969, bringing together men who had not seen each other since the war's end. They shared memories of battles, honored fallen comrades who had died in service, and began the slow process of educating Americans about their unique contribution. The gathering marked a turning point. These warriors who had fought in silence could finally tell their stories to a nation that had forgotten them. Public recognition accelerated in subsequent decades. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th National Code Talkers Day. In 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded congressional gold medals to the original 29 Code Talkers, honoring their creation of the code that had baffled Japanese intelligence throughout the war. Chester Nez, the last surviving member of the original 29, died in 2014 at age 93, having lived to see his wartime service finally acknowledged and celebrated. His passing marked the end of an era, but the legacy of the Code Talkers endured. The complete story encompassed complexities that transcended simple narratives of military triumph. Code Talkers had served a nation that had oppressed their people, using a language that government had tried to destroy to achieve victories that saved countless American lives. They demonstrated that diversity represented strength rather than weakness, that America's multicultural heritage provided advantages enemies could not replicate or counter. The Navajo language, preserved through centuries of resistance to Spanish colonization and American expansion, proved more effective than the era's most sophisticated encryption technologies. Modern military communicators still study the Code Talker program as an example of how cultural assets can provide operational advantages. The principle they demonstrated, that linguistic diversity can be weaponized for security purposes, influenced subsequent conflicts and continues to shape military communications doctrine. During the Iraq War, the Marine Corps employed speakers of Hmong and other uncommon languages for secure communications, applying lessons learned from the Navajo Code Talkers 6 decades earlier. The legacy lived on in these contemporary applications, though no system has matched the Code Talkers' combination of perfect security, operational speed, and cultural significance. The Code Talkers' story reminds us that history's heroes often emerge from unexpected places. Young Navajo men who had been dismissed as primitive by mainstream American society proved essential to defeating technologically sophisticated adversaries. Their language, relegated to reservations and boarding school punishments, became America's most valuable communication asset. They fought for a nation that had broken its treaties with their people, proving that patriotism transcends past injustices. In the war's aftermath, as Japanese codebreakers learned how completely they had been baffled by a language they never imagined existed, the Code Talkers returned home in silence, warriors whose greatest victory remained classified for a generation. Their story, finally told, stands as testament to courage, ingenuity, and the unexpected ways that cultural preservation can shape human history's most decisive moments.